Halito, and welcome to Let's Talk with myself, Regan DeLoggins, and John Kane. John, are you there?
Yeah, I'm there. For some reason, I didn't hear any music on this end. Reggie, did we do any intro music this time?
Oh yeah, no, you
No,
did.
we
That's
we
why.
did. I forgot. I forgot to patch you in on that. Sorry, John.
I'm waiting for the music to start and you fade out so we can join it. But yes, I am here. These are just some of the minor technical difficulties we have by doing everything remotely. But we are getting better at it each week. I think we're finding little improvements here and there to the to what we're doing here, and I can't tell you how much I appreciate having Regan and Reggie a part of what we're trying to do here each week. It's you look, we are in fund drive mode, and one of the things that's obvious is this whole COVID-19 issue is it offers challenges, but I'll tell you, one of the biggest challenges it offers is the fact that we still have to pay the bills at WBAI. So I do have to implore people who are listening to the show, whether you're listening to the show or watching the show on Facebook Live as we stream it each week, or whether you listen to it after the fact. It's really important that people support the station. And you can go to the pledge line. You go to 516-620-3602 to make a one-time donation. You can become a BAI buddy in the name of Let's Talk. But it is really necessary. We believe that certainly this show and other shows on WBAI are bringing you information and bringing you content that you're not going to get anywhere else. And some of that content is particularly important right now because of everything that's going on. So in spite of the fact that everything seems to be disrupted, our lives are disrupted in many ways, we all still have to fulfill certain obligations and responsibilities. And of course, we are listener-supported radio, so we do count on what you guys do to support this radio station and to support this program. We are doing a 1 hour show, and it looks like we'll probably be doing 1 hour shows during this fund drive. But I'll tell you, the more of you who step up and support Let's Talk, the more time we get. And I'm hoping we can get back to our 2 hour schedule once we're out of fund drive mode. But you have a say in that. You have a say in that by essentially voting with your dollars, if you will, to support WBAI and to support Let's Talk with John and Regan. So again, the 516-620-3602 is the number to call to make a pledge. One-time donation, a WBAI buddy program you can enlist to, or you can go online. You go to give2wbai.org. That's GIVE, the number 2 WBAI.org, and there you can even follow the prompts to make a text donation, a donation via text. So. Again, I ask that you support the station, and support the show as you're supporting the station, and we'll try to keep this powerful content going. Regan, you have a guest that's joining us this week, and I'm going to let you handle the introduction. This is we did just come out of on Monday. Was it Monday or Tuesday? It was Tuesday, I guess.
Tuesday.
Yeah, Tuesday. It was Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, Girls, Two-Spirit Awareness Day, and it wasn't just national. This was international. This was going out all over the world to raise awareness to the problem of that Indigenous people face, but again, the most vulnerable people within our communities face with this. I hate to call it an epidemic because this is man-made. This isn't a pathogen, but this idea that we've got such a large number of missing and murdered people among our community. So Tuesday was the awareness day for that. So what we're doing today is kind of an extension. And I'll let you take it from there, Regan.
Thanks, John. I appreciate that. Just to echo what John said, Tuesday, May 5th, which was the national, but now has become an international day of mourning, honoring, and remembering those who are the most targeted within our Indigenous communities, which are women, girls, Two-Spirit, which is our queer community, and trans women and trans folks in general, are the most targeted in our communities for sexual violence and murder. The campaign MMIW, which is for missing and murdered Indigenous women, has been gaining more traction recently as more folks have been paying attention. And we expand the acronym to MMIW G2ST, which is Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, Girls, Two-Spirit, and Trans folks, in order to highlight the atrocities happening. Currently in the occupied United States, there are over 5,712 missing cisgendered women from our lands. And these are only the recorded numbers, and also the numbers that we see are specific to cisgendered women. So it's almost double the number if we consider outside our gender, into our gender gradients within our communities. So today, we have Jolene Holgate joining us today from Dineh. She is the project manager for Missing and Murdered Dineh relatives in Navajo Nation, which is a community-based working group utilizing a data-driven approach for understanding the missing and murdered crisis, and are working to empower Navajo communities to engage in community mobilization to recover missing relatives and provide healing to families of murdered victims. Jolene is Dineh, and some of us know the nation as Navajo Nation. So she's a Dineh woman from Shanto, Arizona, and currently resides in so-called Flagstaff, Arizona. And she is of the Many Goats clan on her mother's side and born to the Eagle Reed people on her father's side. Jolene, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Oh, hi. It's so good to hear your voice.
Hi, yeah. How's it going?
Hi, Jolene. This is John.
So good.
Hi, John.
It's great to have you join the show. We sure do appreciate you taking some time out to spend with us and to discuss this really, really important issue. So I'm gonna again continue to hand it off to Regan on this one. I'll just chime in from time to time.
That sounds great, John. Jolene, thank you so much for being here. I gave a little intro, but I don't know if you want to introduce yourself as well.
Sure, thanks. My name is Jolene Holgate, and as Regan had mentioned before, I am the project manager for Missing and Murdered Dineh relatives. And if I have any Navajo relatives who might actually be tuning in, I'll go ahead and do my traditional opening here. So I am of the Many Goats clan, born for the Eagle Reed people. I am from the Navajo Nation, and currently I do work with Council Delegate Amber Kinez Bakrati, who is one of our fierce leaders on the 24th Navajo Nation Council. And want to thank Regan as well as your radio show for providing us some time to talk and provide us a platform.
Absolutely. We're so glad to have you. I was giving a brief description of what MMIW G2ST is for those who are listening who are unaware. And I really want to affirm the work that you do for your community and the Indigenous community as a large. And I was just hoping if you could give a little brief overview of the work that you do through MMDR.
So the work that we do, we were established in March 2019, and a lot of it stemmed from the work when the Navajo Nation established its Navajo Nation Sexual Assault Prevention Subcommittee. And that was created in response to the tragic loss of Ashlyn Mike in Shiprock, New Mexico. She was kidnapped, raped, and murdered. Along with her brother was kidnapped as well, but he was able to escape. And his name is Ian Mike. And so we took a look at these different issues, did some resource gapping. We worked with state and federal agencies to look at what they provide. And if you're not too familiar with the Navajo Nation, we do span into 3 different states, and we are about 27,000 square miles. We are larger than, I believe, the state of Virginia. However, with that is, a population of about 150,000 residing on the reservation, and then about 150,000 of our Navajo relatives who reside in urban areas throughout the nation. So as I think John mentioned before, we don't label the missing and murdered crisis, MMDR, basically as an epidemic. We do recognize that it's an issue that is an ongoing crisis that has historical roots dating back to the initial colonization of the American Southwest. One of our major partners right now is the Navajo Nation Missing Persons Updates, and that is led by the founder, Meski Yatsiri. They are the actual boots on the ground volunteer advocates who mobilize when a relative goes missing. They have text alerts. They have a way where you can submit information to create and generate a flyer. And they're an amazing group. They've been a very powerful partner with MMDR, and certainly want to make sure I give them that shout out. And any type of proceeds that we receive, half always goes to their organization because we want to make sure that they are supported. So the approach that we took with MMDR was more of an all hands on deck. Our team is made up from individuals from an array of backgrounds to try to take a multidisciplinary approach to the missing and murdered crisis. We want it to be data-driven, and we want to start looking at understanding the missing and murdered crisis. But at the same time, we want to make sure that we're also creating programming that supports the families, whether they've lost a relative who's missing or if they need that healing component. And one major question that we got when we were holding community forums were, well, we were able to recover our relatives, thankfully, alive, but what happens next? Who takes care of them? How do they take care of themselves after going through that? So we definitely want to make sure that we elevate the voices of the family and promote their healing. Of course, our ultimate goal is to recover our relatives and to promote justice in the work that we do. We do try to emphasize community outreach and prevention, and we do have a team who is looking to do work in terms of domestic and sexual violence prevention, programming for our LGBTQI2S relatives, and then even looking at male trauma. We do understand that a lot of violence perpetrated against our women and children are significantly perpetrated by our male relatives. But we also want to understand that dynamic in terms of how do we support their healing? Where can we nip it in the bud where male relatives who are entrenched in a lot of, patriarchal ideologies that lead to toxic masculinity, that leads to the perpetuation of violence, where can we provide that support to male relatives to prevent that? So the other big component to our work is encouraging community mobilization. Right now, we are ready to launch a community toolkit for missing persons. So what happens on the Navajo Nation is if a case does qualify for a search and rescue, then it's out of our hands and we'll leave it to police and emergency management to take it from there but we will also be there as a support to the families. However, there is a lot of cases that are not approved for a search and rescue, and that's where this toolkit comes in. This would allow families to set up their incident command centers, how to communicate with and how to work with police and emergency management. They would also learn how to keep track of the communication log as information comes in. They will also see, how to delegate roles, how to do a grid search, those sorts of things. And then also what's great about this toolkit is you can also tailor it for some of the border town urban areas. There's still a lot of refinement that needs to go into our toolkit. I think it's one of the first of its kind in the Southwest, so we're hoping to launch this here pretty soon. But a lot of our work did slow down because of the pandemic. So right now we are creating a community survey. So there's just a lot that's going on, and we are volunteer-based and zero-funded. And so, yeah, we're always looking for support in any type of way.
Absolutely. Well, I definitely, before the show's over, will remind people of your organization's name and website so folks can go donate there to continue doing the amazing work that y'all are doing. As you were speaking, I realized that you were talking about that families will need to be approved in order to receive the full search and rescue team, if you will. And I was wondering if you could let me know, or let the listeners know rather, what determines approval?
So there really isn't too clear of a process. It really is just up to the discretion of law enforcement and emergency management. Most cases that we see that are that do qualify for a search and rescue are, of course, Amber Alerts or missing and endangered children, relatives who may be over a certain age are not able to fend for themselves, or relatives who may have a mental or developmental disability where they're not able to, really comprehend their surroundings. And that's generally the qualifications that we have seen that would constitute a search. However, when it comes to relatives who may have an uncle or an auntie who just never came home, or there's no sign of any type of that they could be in any type of potential danger, those cases generally may not qualify for a search and rescue, because although there is no time limit, and I want to let everybody know, and this is pretty much true in most jurisdictions, there is no time frame to file a missing persons report. If your relative has been missing and for instance, like Navajo, just for a couple of hours, you are allowed to file a missing persons report. However, it is up to the discretion of law enforcement whether they feel like it would constitute a search and rescue. And I think a lot of it really has to do with the stigmas out on Navajo. People saying, they just left home, or, they'll be back, don't worry about it. Just give it, 24 more hours. But that time is critical, especially when the family knows the patterns of this relative. They know that this individual would not, just up and leave in that fashion. So that, as far as us, we have never seen an official protocol on what would constitute or for families to have a search and rescue. But in our experience, that's usually what it looks like.
Yeah, I got to ask a few questions on that, because I was curious. That has to create a certain level of tension between, the activity, or when law enforcement is prepared to begin to search, and that's true in almost any community. But as you were indicating, the stigma that gets associated with Native communities, especially Native communities that have been plagued with poverty and and oftentimes a host of other issues that the outside can just look at as, well, they're just trying to escape, and not understand that we do have a sense for when somebody when something is out of the ordinary, and that there's a real danger here. And I just wonder what that tension, how do you as an organization and the Navajo Nation, how do you guys how do you proceed with that tension?
Well, at this point, we haven't gotten into, a deep of a discussion with our public safety. However, when we proposed the idea of creating this community toolkit, from the discussion we had with public safety, they seemed very much on board, because I think this would alleviate a lot of their own responsibilities in collecting the information. It alleviates them having to keep track of what families are, calling in, or, what it is that they want the law enforcement to follow up on. But there is a tension, I know, at the family level between law enforcement and the families. There's that frustration.
Well, and I got to think there's the tension even, goes beyond the family into at least part of the community. And so is there a sense that there is a place for the community to play, a role for the community to play until law enforcement picks it up? I mean, I understand you don't want, people getting in each other's way, so to speak. But I got to think, obviously, the family does. There must be, hopefully, within your toolkit, certain actions that the immediate family can and should take once they've come to the realization that they have a missing family member.
Right. And so we do have preliminary steps that are within the toolkit, and it starts from the very moment when they realize that they have a relative missing. It would explain to them, what information they need to collect, what areas can they search. A lot of the communities on Navajo are fairly small, so it usually takes, not too much time to kind of drive around and see maybe where those usual hangout spots, or checking at relatives' home to see if they're there, checking the schools. And then the next step is checking with hospitals, checking with jail facilities, detox centers, places where, they're able to give that type of information. And then from there, the steps, if it's a child, is the child endangered? Did they just walk off? Or are you sure that the child may have been kidnapped? And then that's when the Amber Alert protocol would be initiated. So yeah, we tried to be very thorough in providing a clear steps for our relatives who are going to be utilizing this toolkit, because it's really confusing. I think the first thing most people would do is they would check all the common places, call everyone they know, and then they would just call the police. But there's actually steps that if they use the toolkit, they would be able to be ready at the go. One thing that we are including is a jurisdiction map. So as I mentioned before, Navajo spans into 3 states, but that's also including 12 counties, and then different Navajo police districts. Let me give you an example. There was a family who lived in Shiprock, stated that they saw a relative who was last seen in Kirtland, New Mexico, which is actually between Shiprock and Farmington, New Mexico. So they called Farmington police. Farmington police told the families, this isn't our jurisdiction, so you may want to have to call Navajo police. So then the family calls Navajo police and says, well, if he was last seen in Kirtland, you need to call the county or the Farmington police. So it was just this runaround, and it creates this huge distrust in the system, distrust in working with law enforcement, because they're given that runaround. So what we're going to include within this toolkit is information as, so where the person was last seen is where it falls into that jurisdiction. So in the case with this individual being in Kirtland, New Mexico, it was something that they were able to file with the county and the city once they got a little bit more information. As you know, most natives will say, they were here, but he's from Shiprock, or he's from Window Rock. Being where you're from kind of sometimes makes it a bit more challenging for maybe non-Indigenous law enforcement to understand. So there's certain language that we have to incorporate within that toolkit to kind of really clarify that process for the families.
Sure.
I really appreciate that, considering I know I don't trust law enforcement, and I don't deal with law enforcement. It's not something that I advocate for. So I think it's really important to have these steps for folks first to navigate the situation in general, because our priority is finding our relatives alive and well, and to provide them with a space to heal. So I really do love this toolkit as a way to help people navigate, and maybe navigate a system, and also maybe not to navigate the system at all, and to look more through community to find our relatives versus relying on law enforcement when it can be so traumatizing. And often there are stigmas with law enforcement, whether it's tribal police or non-tribal police, where there's an assumption that someone is an addict or an alcoholic, or for whatever reason untrustworthy, which are all, inherently racist and problematic stereotypes that lead to our relatives being criminalized before they're even found. Well, so I think I really do appreciate this toolkit.
And I think it's important to note that regardless of whether alcohol or drugs or runaways are involved in this process, it doesn't make the person less in danger. And exactly. The apathy that law enforcement or sometimes even community members can have is something that has to be one of those. It's got to be a huge challenge to overcome, because regardless of what the circumstances, and let's be clear, a lot of times the conditions on our territories that have been policy driven by the federal government, by the state governments, has contributed to the quality of life that is always a challenge for people. And so
Absolutely.
much of the depression, much of the substance abuse, much of the lack of hope or or prospect for the future is not the fault of our people and of our community and community members, and least of all, not the fault of our children. So I think it's really important that regardless, if somebody starts throwing out numbers, well, 50% are runaways, 60% are this, none of that stuff matters, because if there's even a small number of those people, regardless of what put them in a position of danger, it's incumbent on us as a community and an incumbent on law enforcement to put away whatever apathy they want to immediately display and say, look, these are lives that we need to protect.
Yeah,
absolutely. This is Jolene and I were talking about this briefly yesterday. Even it doesn't, as you said, John, just to echo your sentiment, it does not matter whether this person has run away before, whether this person has addiction issues, it does not matter. They're our community, and we are obligated to find them and to honor them, no matter the circumstance.
Exactly.
Especially since a lot of these issues are based on settler colonial oppression. That's exactly where these issues come from. I also we had spoken about this previously, Jolene, and I'd love to expand on the conversation with John. We wanted to talk about the myths and the misinformation that comes out of the MMIW G2ST movement. And I was hoping that you could discuss or relay the myths that you've seen and had to dispel.
Right. So just again, touching on the point that was brought up about drug and alcohol dependency, a lot of our relatives out there who are in the border town areas, who are unsheltered, or, that stigma is definitely placed on Indigenous people, and it's the same for Navajo. And because of that, I think a lot of our relatives internalize that type of oppression and that type of racism, that we begin to believe it ourselves. So when a relative goes missing, people may say, oh, they probably just went on a bender, or they're probably out drinking or doing drugs. We've even had leadership in our highest office say, people they don't want to be found. They leave and they don't want to be found. And then that narrative shifted to some sort of validation to our own public safety leadership on Navajo, and they were reiterating that same message. That is incredibly dangerous. That is not that's, I think, one of the major myths that we are facing right now that we're definitely trying to dispel, because there's a lot of things that factor into, why relatives, have to leave home. It could be that there's violence existing within the home. There's probably no support within the home, whatever reason that could be. We have to really take a closer look at what those issues are. We do know that there's systemic and social issues at play, and where are we failing within that system on the reservation that, our relatives are not able to get access to those services. They're not able to advocate for themselves when they need help. So I think that's one of the biggest narratives that we're fighting right now. And it has a lot to do with educating our communities and making sure that those who are a part of this movement are also educated in that same way. We do have a team of about, a little over 20 people, but it is an ongoing learning process for all of us. And so, I think that's one major area. And the other is, again, from our Navajo Nation's highest office, is this thing about we need to fix the families, like there shouldn't be single moms, there shouldn't be single parents. And again, that's just another dangerous narrative that not only victim blames and victim shames families, it just really upholds a lot of, settler ideologies that I think really stems from Christianity. And those are absolute narratives when it comes to the missing and murdered, MMIW LGBTQ2S movement because it just doesn't help. I don't know how else to say it.
Well, and excuse me, and the irony of that is that when you look at settler colonialism, as Rian was suggesting, that lies at the foundation of much. I mean, look, there was a rape culture that came with that colonization. Some of the earliest pandemics that we faced were sexually transmitted diseases. The role that the church played in the abuse of our children and young adults was significant. So when that gets kind of thrown up as these so-called Christian ideologies, when you understand how much it's all been undermined over time. So I couldn't agree with you more. There's also the issue with essentially the haves and the have-nots that exist on territories that oftentimes run right along tribal government versus everybody else. And that can there's also tensions that can lie in there. And you mentioned some of the at the highest levels of government, some of the obstacles that you meet, but you can clearly tell when you go into many native territories who are the ones who work for the administrations and who doesn't.
Absolutely. And that, we have to break. I think that's one of the largest issues that we see in Indian country today is that most of our tribal governments are participating in assimilationist tactics. And these assimilationist tactics have so many horrible repercussions. And one of them is victim blaming, especially in relation to MMIW G2ST. And it blows my mind that folks in the, highest power, if you will, would not be advocating for their community, but rather participating in harmful rhetoric that prolongs the damage against your community. Like, that just does not make sense.
Yes, I agree.
Jolene, can you stick with us? Jolene, can you stick with us till just after the break so we can, kind of get all your information and maybe get a final thought from you before we let you go?
Sure.
All right. Well, why don't we take a break? We'll go off with some music. We'll come back and we'll get some final thoughts from Jolene, and then we'll entertain some phone calls before we run out of time here. So we'll do that next. This is John Kane with Rian DeLoggins and with our guest Jolene Holgate. All right, that's "Don't Let Go" by Murray Porter. His song that addresses basically some of the suicide crises that exist on our territories that fit in line with some of the other things that plague our territories. We top a lot of the lists that you don't want to be at the top of, and again, I can't emphasize enough how much of those conditions have been policy driven at the highest levels of the federal government and state government. And it all contributes to this challenge that we're faced with when it comes to our missing and murdered people. So again, I want to introduce and reintroduce, I guess, Jolene Holgate, and Regan has done a fine job reaching out to Jolene to bring her onto the program. Again, any final thoughts that you want to add to this subject as we're kind of winding down the show?
I throw it to Jolene first, I think.
Yeah. Do we still have her there?
Sure.
Okay, there you are.
Yeah, there you are.
Sorry, I was on my mute button here.
I
think some of my final thoughts is we have other relative nations out there, sister nations, who are kind of inquiring about the work that we do and starting these movements within their communities. And we're very much open to helping other communities who do want to start this work within their communities, because I think it's really important to have a dynamic community-based team, but there definitely should be that social justice aspect and perspective within the overall work. I would also encourage that the work that is being carried out includes our LGBTQI2S relatives. I think a lot of the times they are left out of this narrative, and we do need to honor their stories. We do need to honor that a lot of the violent perpetrations that are happening out there are happening against, the queer community. today on our MMDR page, although, Tuesday was MMIW Awareness Day, today we shared a story of Fredericka Martinez, who was a Two-Spirit youth that was murdered in Colorado. They were a 16-year-old Dineh youth who was bludgeoned to death, and because of who they were, their identity. So I think that's one important component that I want to leave in terms of a final thought. And also grassroots work. Like, it does not, how we address these issues does not work from the top down. It works from the ground up.
Well, give us your information again. With your I'm sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead. Go ahead, Regan.
It's okay. I was going to say, now that is an excellent line. You're absolutely right. Grassroots come from the ground up. And Jolene, thank you so much for your time. I also do want to just tell you that you're doing such amazing work on back in the Southwest, and I can't wait to collaborate with you and do some work here in Lenape, King. For folks listening, please make sure to go to www.navajo, NAVAJOMMDR.com so that you can send some donations. As Jolene said, the donations will go to her work, as well as the work of some other sister organizations who are doing similar advocacy for missing and murdered Indigenous peoples. And Jolene, thank you so much for joining us today. You're one of, as I told you yesterday, I'm fangirling out. You're one of my favorite people.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on the show. I really do appreciate it.
Well, and we'd love to have you come back. So don't forget us, because we'll probably pester you to join us again.
Of course. Thank you.
All right. Again, that's Jolene Holgate. She's with Navajo MMDR. That's missing and murdered Dineh relatives. Look, let me go ahead and give out the phone number. We'll start to take some calls. I know we're on a shortened schedule here because of the fund drive. Again, I want to remind people to go to the pledge line, 516-620-3602. Go to the donation page that we have, the site we have, which is give2wbai.org. That's GIVE, the number 2, WBAI.org. Let management, let the world know that you care about what we produce and what we deliver, not only in this show, but what WBAI's content does in general. And the best way to do that is to make a contribution to the station. All right, the number to call in to participate in the show, and I realize we're time short, but we'll try to get a few callers in here, is 212-209-2877. That's 212-209-2877. That's the number to call. We talk about the guests we've had or any other issues. There's always many to talk about here. When being the only Native voices that can present a Native perspective to the New York City listening audience and those who listen beyond, there's always plenty to talk about. So again, 212. Reggie, you just let me know when when we get a caller on the line.
Yep.
And in the meantime, one of the things, and we have to mention that as much as we put an emphasis on missing and murdered Indigenous women and of course girls and Two-Spirit, look, our men face much of this. I mean, and we see this across all people of color, but certainly our young men and even our full grown men can oftentimes find them in situations where violence is perpetrated against them as well. And we've seen that. And of course, we've seen a failure of law enforcement to ever really do anything about it, or the justice system to do anything about it. So when we talk about missing and murdered Indigenous, we're talking about Indigenous people. And it really, look, there's no question that there are more vulnerable people within our community. Some are more vulnerable than others. But I think it's important that people realize that we have a high incidence of violence that is perpetrated against Native people, especially because of the jurisdictional problems that Jolene talked a little bit about, but also because of the apathy that exists. Sometimes it's worse because of our communities being so remote, where we have a large area that's got to be protected, I guess, with a sparse population, and so the resources aren't there and that kind of thing. So I just look, I hesitate sometimes to not bring up the fact that our men are also at risk.
I think that it's also important that some people may not know that on our reservations, if non-Native people perpetrate violence and then leave the reservation, we are unable to we're unable to persecute them through our own law enforcement. Not that I advocate for law enforcement. Nonetheless, it's important to note that then those cases have to be picked up by the FBI in order for them to be investigated. So many of these cases go unnoticed. Honestly, there's a huge issue with our sovereignty laws in relation to how we can persecute non-Native folks. And in relation to the numbers that I was saying earlier about missing and murdered Indigenous women, specifically it was about cisgendered women, 80% of the violence perpetrated against Indigenous women is from non-Native people. And there's a direct correlation between man camps, the creation of man camps along pipelines, construction sites, and other resource extraction sites. There is a direct correlation between those man camps and the rising number of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit.
Well, and that's exactly right. And even to the extent that sometimes this conversation gets distracted because of alcohol or drug or whatever else. Keep in mind that we don't manufacture that stuff on our territories. Somebody's got to bring it there. And so when I look at what our people are experiencing in our territories, you have a certain level of apathy. Sometimes that sovereignty issue that you brought up, Regan, is actually thrown back in our faces. We know that federal law and state law oftentimes protects non-Native people from Native law enforcement or Native jurisdiction. And so while it may be illegal to do these things, if you have an absence of any kind of a law enforcement, it almost becomes, those laws almost become void for vagueness and non-enforceability. And that's what we face on a lot of these territories. And so many of these, this domestic violence and this abuse that takes place on our territories, even if it does get reported initially, it falls flat because of the obscure jurisdictional lines that get crossed with all of this.
And if you're interested in learning more about specifically about missing and murdered Indigenous girls, women, Two-Spirit folks, and trans folks, the collective I belong to, the Indigenous Kinship Collective, we're hosting weekly webinars on Wednesday evenings, 7 to 8:30 Eastern Standard Time, with different speakers who have dedicated their work to MMIW G2ST. You can find out more about that on indigenouskinshipcollective.com. It's all one word. And please join us. We have some really excellent speakers in the coming weeks.
Okay, look like we got a caller.
To talk about their work in relation to the most targeted in our community.
All right, sounds good. Hey, Reggie, before you go to the caller that we've got online, what's Michael G's program? It's on Wednesdays from what time?
The law,
Living in the City, or
living for the city, and that's on Wednesdays at 11 a.m.
All right.
Here on WBAI.
I bring it up because
yes.
I'm going to be a guest on the show next week, just so you know.
There we go.
Yeah.
There it is.
And I also want to mention before we go to the callers that next week I plan to have Shawnee Rice join us as a guest. So,
Shawnee,
because although Regan knew this, nobody, it's like, don't tell Dad, right? So I was the last to find out that Shawnee tested positive for COVID-19. She attempted to leave the city to avoid this disease, and she took a friend with her who actually infected her. So she actually brought, like so many others, brought New York City's plague back home. So I want Shawnee to tell us what her experience was, what she went through, where she's at now, because I think she also plans to donate blood for antibody testing and that kind of stuff. So she's going to join us next week. That's the plan anyway, and hopefully that comes to fruition. But I know the listeners who like so many of us have grown to love Shawnee would be, I'm sure, going to be happy to hear her back on the program with us. All right,
Awesome.
let's. Why don't we go ahead and do that? We'll go to a caller. I know we're probably not going to fit a whole lot in, but I think it's important to fit in what we can. So we're going to go to a caller. Caller, you're up first. What's your name and where are you calling from?
It's Peter from Tampa.
Hey, Peter, it's good to hear from you.
I have this deserves. I'm glad, even though I got a minute. This deserves a quick mention. Bolsonaro, the head of Brazil.
Yeah.
He says he doesn't believe that corona is real. But what I heard mentioned a few days ago, it got a little mention, was that the people who are really suffering are the Amazonian natives, because they have such as far as access to medical care. I mean, now add to that the guy doesn't believe it's real. I mean, they're very vulnerable. You know what I'm saying? I mean, I don't know if you're aware of that issue, that the Amazonian natives are like, as stranded, as hard as it is for the regular Brazilians, to get medical care with Bolsonaro. Imagine how hard it is for the people most vulnerable.
Well, and part of the issue that one would assume, because many of our territories are sometimes more remote, that we would have very little access and that the spread wouldn't make it to our territories. But the problem is, because we live in close-knit communities, once it does enter into a community, it becomes it can spread relatively quickly, and so that's the problem.
Absolutely, right.
And I think there's an assumption that somehow our remoteness protects us, and it really doesn't, because there's always a constant. We have a lot of people, whether it's missionaries, whether it's people who are speculating what they can do with our lands or our peoples. We have a constant flow of people that come in and out of our territories, and so we aren't as isolated as people think, but we are a close-knit community, so it makes it more vulnerable. So I appreciate the call, Peter. Thanks for bringing it up. All right, Reggie, do we have another caller on the line?
It's most likely the last caller.
All right, we'll do it. Caller, you're up next, and you're up last. What's your name? Where are you calling from?
Hi, I'm Erebos from West Harlem.
Hey, thanks for being a part of the show. What's on your mind?
The issues that you mentioned, the ongoing issues that are generational in terms of the targeted destruction of the native people. I was wondering, like, what type of mobilization, organization, and do you accept the assistance or help from allies? What's actually being done? Because it's the reality is it is what it is. It's just that if there's just an emphasis on the analysis of what's wrong and what's going on, and I just wanted to know, like, what can people actually do? How can they get involved if they wanted to get involved, or they should get involved? What's the response?
Yeah, I think that there are a number of ways to get involved in relation to MMIW G2ST. One of them is going to Jolene's organizational website, which is Navajo MMDR, and you can, if you'd like to, you can donate there. Specifically, their funds will go to maintaining the projects that they have. But also, if you are local and you're looking to get connected, as I said, I'm in a collective called the Indigenous Kinship Collective, and we do a lot of, we'll be hosting sessions in relation to this conversation, and we'd love for folks to join. And if you'd like, when you're on the calls, you can donate to our different guest speakers who will be speaking. And there's also the American Indian Community House, which is based in Manhattan, which is Manhattan, who has been doing some work related to this, to MMIW G2ST as well. So there are a number of local organizations who participate in outreach and awareness and education. And those are just the ones off the top of my head. But there's also MMIP, which is Missing and Murdered Indigenous People, which is an organization based out of First Nations, I believe, in occupied Canada. And they do a lot of great work and research. And then the last place I'd recommend, sorry, this is just like a list. The last place I'd recommend, I'm sorry?
No, so pardon me from cutting across you, is just you mentioned Canada, and Justin Trudeau and a lot of the native councils over there were legislating laws and actual policies on this issue. Or was there any movement on that?
Yeah, the conversation that's happening in First Nations territories in relation to MMIW DQST is very different than the one happening here in the occupied United States. Unfortunately, a lot of the discussion here in the occupied United States is very premature and is just in its infancy and which is unfortunate because people are being lost. But there are some task forces, and most of them are maintained on the actual reservation rather than as federal law.
And on the Canadian side, although the conversations had advanced, I know they did a whole commission and issued final reports on this thing. We've talked about that on the program before. The problem is that it gets met with a lot of bureaucracy and still a lot of the racism that exists on the Canadian side. So even though the conversations are happening and there is the talk, there hasn't really been the walk yet. Unfortunately, on the U.S. side, we barely even have the conversation. Look, there was a big deal, and I'm only going to mention it in passing because I don't want to harp on this thing, but there was more noise over the native image taken off of the Land O'Lakes butter package than the fact that we actually have real human beings that turn up that are made missing, because of policy. And so I think it's, one of the things that allies can do is keep this conversation going, so people understand that this is an issue, that people are made missing on our territories, and I think keeping that conversation is really going is really important. So I want to thank you so much for calling. Look, I know we're short on time; we're almost out of time. So, real quick, hey. Regan mentioned the American Indian Community House, and I would be remiss if I didn't mention that the former director of the American Indian Community House, Kevin Tarrant, lost his battle with COVID-19. It came as a shock to many of us. Kevin has been a guest on the show. I worked to try to use our program as somewhat of a bridge and a support for the American Indian Community House, and Kevin is where I began some of that. So again, I want to give my condolences to Kevin's family and all the people in New York who I'm sure miss him. We'll be back next week, and hopefully Shawnee Rice will be with us. So we'll catch you guys then. Thanks, Regan, and again, my thanks to Jolene for joining us, and we'll pick it up next week. Yahweh.